I remember in 2005, again, like 500,000 people in the streets protesting, not just specifically against the Iraq war, but also really against the Bush administration, against neoconservatism. There was a heavy skepticism of government, of this sort of putting things in these black and white terms, like, we're on the side of freedom, and you're either with us or against us. A lot of like normal folks and a lot of Democrats, a lot of liberals really push back against framing things in those ways. And also, I remember a lot of folks pointing to the fact that the Al-Qaeda really stemmed out of the fact that we had backed the Mujahideen and armed and funded the Mujahideen to fight Russia.
Yeah, that photo of Donald Rumsfeld shaking Saddam Hussein's hand was everywhere. I mean, you saw it wherever you looked on the internet, on these like liberal forums and whatever.
Exactly. So again, it just seems as though there was like a heavy critique, again, of U.S. foreign policy, of intelligence agencies, of, again, neoconservatism. And now that's been completely flipped around where, George W. Bush could almost run in the Democratic Party and possibly win. It's just it's crazy. Like sometimes I think I'd like to just like sit down some liberals and have them watch an episode of The Daily Show from 2005 just to get like what their reaction would be. So isn't that like a major factor as well? Like it seems almost like a cultural shift where people have been completely turned around 180 degrees to support policies and, again, like support just like the idea of, we're fighting for freedom. It's about democracy versus authoritarianism. It seems as though they've really embraced that concept that they would have been against 15 years ago.
Well, yeah, I mean, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger are the two Republicans that liberals valorize the most. And they also coincidentally happen to be two of the Republicans with the most hardcore neocon oriented foreign policy views. And I don't think it actually is a coincidence. I came of age, obviously, as well, during the Iraq war. That was the formative event for me and kind of shaping my political consciousness. And in hindsight, I've more and more come to the realization that a huge amount of what appeared at the time to be anti-war sentiment, a huge amount of what appeared at the time to be a really kind of full throttle activist spirit in opposing the war, because although the war obviously was ultimately launched in 2003, there was a significant opposition to it, not just among activists, but also within the media, within Congress, where you had something like 30, I think, senators vote against the Iraq war, all Democrats and one Republican. And what I think is sort of incontrovertible is that a huge percentage, I'm not saying all of it, but a huge percentage, more than I would have appreciated contemporaneously, of that sentiment was probably based on just a partisan reflex. I mean, I think a lot of people just didn't like Bush. They had cultural qualms with Bush. There's such a cult of personality around every president now, pro and con, right? I mean, we're all supposed to have these really passionate beliefs about the president as like a personage, right? I mean, Trump was probably the apex of that because his personality traits were so dominant and basically just informed how everybody thought, what everybody thought he was doing in office. I mean, this is why there's such confusion around what the Trump administration's policy on Russia actually was, where he actually exceeded Obama in taking extremely consequential antagonistic actions toward Russia, such as sending arms to Ukraine, lethal arms, at the behest of Lindsey Graham and John McCain in 2017. But that's basically ignored because what is it that informs the perception of Trump's governance for the vast majority of kind of people who are aware of this thing? It's just his rhetoric, it's his tweets, it's his style, it's his crass affectation, and every now and then they can isolate an example of him saying something that rhetorically maybe seems slightly positive or weird about Putin, and then that gets extrapolated into a firm conclusion about how he was supposedly soft on Putin, which obviously just is not true on any level if you look at the actual policy, but people aren't interested in that. So yeah, I think that in 2000, I think we can only really conclude in hindsight that a lot of the anti-war sentiment that we would think was just about the war itself really was just about partisanship. And that's a pretty damning indictment, I think, of American political culture. Because, although there was no invasion as large scale as Iraq under Obama, there were plenty of actions that he took, with Libya and Syria and Afghanistan and so on, that could have generated at least some street mobilization to oppose, but it didn't happen. And today, again, the anti-war movement, such as it existed, is totally neutered. Yeah, I think one of the explanations for it is that we probably overly assumes that the anti-war movement of the early 2000s was driven by genuine anti-war belief and not kind of completely entangled with this kind of partisan reflex. That said, even if there must have been some percentage of it that was actually driven by anti-war sentiment, right? I just think it was probably overstated. And you did see large protests all over the place. The protests that took place in London is still the largest that's ever happened prior to the Iraq War. And it's just almost unfathomable that you'd see anything comparable now. And I think part of that cultural shift that you mentioned owes to a shift in priorities amongst the so-called left. In the early 2000s, when I kind of just generally thought of the left, and my political views weren't as well formulated as they are today, but when I just took a broad brush on the left and would summarize what they were about, a huge portion of it would have been about foreign policy. Opposing the war on terror, opposing like extraordinary rendition and torture and mass surveillance, and the Iraq War and the escalation of the Afghanistan War, and these different aspects of CIA and FBI overreach and so on and so forth. Today, there's almost zero indication that any of that animates, like, at least the organized activist left.
Right. It's become essentially,
if it never comes up at all, it's a side
politics. Essentially, but
yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, what does appear to animate them? Well, I mean, we have some evidence based on what happened in 2020. In 2020, it was giddily proclaimed, including by the New York Times, that the protest movement that broke out after George Floyd was the largest protest movement in U.S. history, and I covered a lot of it. I mean, I went and talked to people who had been in these kind of protest/riot areas, and on and on and on. And so if that issue, and I'm not saying that the issue of police violence is unimportant, but clearly that protest movement expanded well beyond just being about police violence. I mean, you go to one of those protests and it would be, dominated by somehow people chanting about trans stuff. It would be about just the kind of intricacies of these different kind of racial speech codes that people had to now abide by. It would be about, coercing sports teams into choosing different mascots and names, and, getting corporate brands to signal their solidarity, and on and on and on. And I think that's a pretty, unmistakable reflection of where the priorities lie in this same activist community. It's all about different identity issues. I don't think today you could ever hope, at least under current circumstances, to have a large scale movement that is, oriented around the left, that was not largely based on this whole multiplicity of identity related preoccupations. And so, the war stuff and the mass surveillance stuff and, the CIA, FBI overreach stuff, all that's pretty much gone by the wayside. And in fact, the left, mostly the liberals, but also tacitly in a way, the left were abettors under the Trump administration of rejuvenating the intelligence services, kind of presenting them as leaders of the anti-Trump resistance, and they would excuse or even outright support incredibly unprecedented actions that were taken by the national security state to undermine Trump because they didn't like Trump. So, for example, in 2017, after Trump fired Comey, the FBI director, this guy, Andrew McCabe, who had been the deputy director, took over as the interim director for a time. And McCabe launched a criminal investigation into Trump when Trump was sitting as president. This is the FBI director launching a criminal investigation against the incumbent democratically elected president on the ground that McCabe thought or speculated that Trump's foreign policy views, so not anything that Trump had done, just his expressed foreign policy views with regard to Russia were intrinsically a threat to national security. That's what the FBI did in 2017. And have you heard much consternation about that amongst these left liberal types who, at least in theory, maybe in a different era would have claimed some kind of aversion to this, FBI overreach and intervention into domestic political affairs? I didn't hear much about it at all. I mean, I wrote a column about it, but I'm one guy, and I'm not, I don't have very much reach compared to others. So yeah, I mean, I think again, we have a number of different factors here that have coalesced into, I think, what you rightly call a huge cultural shift particularly in the composition of the left, the activist left, and their kind of appendages in the media, that just makes it no longer the in thing to oppose war. In fact, this war is often framed as a endeavor that will actually promote left-wing type goals or left liberal goals. Well, they'll say that one of the new modes of talking about foreign policy that's become popular in the Democratic Party is to say that the U.S. needs to have a global strategy that's tailored to opposing authoritarianism,
right,
or right-wing attempts to curtail liberal democracy, right? And of course, Putin was situated as the number one offender in this respect. And so, you'll have like vaguely leftish sounding justifications cited for why this latest U.S. military intervention must be unambiguously supported. And this isn't entirely new. I mean, even during the Iraq War, there were more liberal-oriented arguments made for why Bush's war ought to be supported. But I think today it's sort of different because there's just nowhere near anything like even the dissension that you saw during Iraq. So, I mean, if Bernie Sanders can vote for the $40 billion in war funding, I haven't actually seen him explain that vote. I mean, curiously, a lot of these people seem muted in giving any kind of rationalization for what they've done. But I'm assuming that he would probably invoke this whole framework that actually was part of his foreign policy paradigm in the 2020 campaign, which is that the U.S. needs to oppose global authoritarianism, and needs to, which they were blaming at the time Trump for being like a component of. And yeah, I'm sure that's how he would frame his support for this bill. So yeah, it's just one reason why the current consensus is so intractable is because you have tons of different angles with which that consensus can be fortified, ideologically. So the Republicans, a lot of them have revived a lot of their sort of ancestral anti-Soviet hysteria, where you had Ted Cruz yesterday or the day before justifying his vote for the war based on this idea that Putin is trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union. Tom Cotton has said similar things. And then you have, liberals who are just in this frenzied anti-Putin state no matter what happens. And then even on the left, you have these kind of convoluted arguments about how, the ideal left-wing foreign policy is to be like this active promoter of anti-authoritarianism throughout the world, whatever the hell that means in practice. I mean, I don't know how that would
Extending
actually
US
work in a way.
hegemony.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, that's why I think the consensus is so unwavering, really, because it has many different angles with which people with different ideological bents can fortify it.